Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. In my opinion, there is no other contemporary architecture design school with a greater reputation for experimentation, for radicalism, for theoretical ideas, for alternative practices than the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. Since its founding in 1847, the Architectural Association has continually sought to challenge the structures of architecture education. It's known as a place for debate, for ideas, for critique, and it's also known for the alumni who have passed through it over the years, including people like Rem Koolhaas, like Zaha Hadid, Stephen Hole, Cedric Price, and Denise Scott Brown. What's going on at this school? How does something like this happen? How do you continually create a place for experimentation like this? And perhaps more importantly, how do you not rest on your laurels and continue to look forward? These are the questions on my mind when I invited Ingrid Schroder on the show. Ingrid was appointed the director of the Architectural Association in May 2022. She had previously spent more than 20 years teaching at Cambridge, where she was the head of design teaching and the director of the MPhil in architecture and urban design at the University of Cambridge's Department of Architecture. She's taught in architecture programs around the world, and her ongoing research looks at pedagogical models, shifting perceptions of nature and landscape in the face of climate change, and the architecture and urbanism of liberation from the American Revolution through the late 20th century. She's also the co-author of the 2014 book, African Modernism. As you can tell from that bio, Ingrid is interested in a lot of different things and has thought deeply about what it means to teach architecture and design today. This is a truly wide-ranging conversation that looks at the history of the AA and how she stepped into that place to think about how to bring it forward, about what the AA looks like in the future. We talk about the state of design education and how she thinks about curating curriculums for a variety of architecture students. We talk about what it means to be experimental today, the role of research in design academia, and even her PhD thesis, which was on the development of Washington, D.C. There's a lot packed into this conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Scratching the Surface is supported by listeners like you. If you like what we do here, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus interviews, full transcripts, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and help keep this show free for everyone all the time. You can head over to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Ingrid Schroder. You were appointed the director of the AA, Architectural Association School of Architecture, back in May 2022. Is when you got the job, May, I think.
Yeah, that's when the elections were, but I didn't start until
Till
September. Yeah.
And I've never been to the building. I read that there's a blue English heritage plaque outside the building that says most famous architects have been here sooner or later. Is that a true story?
It's not there it was temporarily, it was a student project.
Okay.
Um, there are
Okay.
other blue plaques for this famous sort of Bloomsbury Group, people, but, that was a kind of, a real but joke project of a student from the past, but it's also true.
Well, and I mean, that's what I was going to say. I couldn't tell if it was real or not, but I think it does speak to the legacy and the history of the AA, which is sort of has a unique place in architecture history of producing, um, essentially like all the architects that we know, many of the architects that we know. And I'm wondering how you come into a place like that as its recently appointed director, with this rich history, and how you think about leading it into the future without resting on that reputation, or what is the mandate that a new director has of an institution with a history like the AA?
I think the word mandate is a really interesting one because actually, I think we're the only institution where the entire body of the school elects its director.
Right.
Um, I had so many conversations with people who said, it's a weirdly political role in that respect, and that we're an association as well as a school. So everyone who's part of the membership has potentially a vote. So, that those sort of 13 hours of talks, presentations, meeting students, meeting staff is a sort of compressed, campaign. And out of that, the mandate comes from this incredibly diverse group of people, some of whom are part of that legacy of the school, but many of whom are, 18, 19, 20-year-old students who, for them, they
Mm,
are potentially the future of architecture. And for them, the Rems and the Zahas and the Richard Rogers and the Norman Fosters are, they know of them, and perhaps that's why they came to the school. But I think for them, those big names are something, and they're not of the past, but actually, I think we're in an educational environment where, those bigger practices, those bigger projects aren't so much in the forefront. I mean, I think
mm,
particularly in the UK and in Europe, I think that there's a big trend to perhaps more collective thinking,
mhm,
a real interest in investing in existing architectures, existing urban conditions. The students are very politically motivated. So there's a big shift in orientation, which I think there's probably very little room for the celebration of the singular name or the so-called
mhm.
star architect. I hate the term. But and so actually I think we're all a little bit conscious about not resting on our laurels, but also, we don't hire those people. We're not like the sort of US institutions where you have the biggest name with the biggest professorships. Most of our staff are kind of young. They're emerging practices. And in many ways, it's good if they emerge and then get too big and have to move on because their practice is so successful. And then we get the next person that nobody's heard of who becomes fantastic.
You said it's almost like there's too much going on to rest on your laurel. There's too much to look forward to, and I think that is true. And I want to
Mm,
talk about the future in a bit, but that seems very hard to me. And maybe I'm sort of thinking about this in a narrow way, but I think, like, I look at a lot of institutions around the world, I'm not going to name names, that feel to me like they're resting on alumni, on their name, on their
mm,
brand,
mm,
on innovative work that came out of the institution 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that move to evolve, to not be looking back, but to look forward, seems like it's really hard. How
mm.
is that? Just because the AA has this history of sort of challenging norms and being experimental, is that just a also way to not look back? Like, how do you actually do, like, what does that look like on the ground to sort of know all that's behind you, but you're looking forward?
I think it's because we're small in some senses in
Mm,
terms of bureaucracy. I mean, it's a huge school now, and we're sort of 900 students, and
yeah.
I, it's, I was talking to I think Deborah Berg, who said, like, my God, like you're enormous, and it doesn't
Yeah.
look like that because if you ever come to the AA, it's in the sort of small series of Georgian houses. Um, we're kind of light on our feet, and we talk about this a lot, but because we don't have the overarching structure of a bigger university, things can move very quickly.
Mhm.
And there's opportunities arise. Students are given the chance to develop projects, to make suggestions, to change the space around them. That I think if we were a proper institution, that wouldn't be possible. And I think that there's a hunger. The radicalism is in the kind of quick turnover of ideas.
Mm,
And I think I keep reminding myself that, Rem was just one of those students who did a really bizarre kind of summer project that involving the Berlin Wall that then kind of emerges into something like those more famous projects. But ultimately, he was in some respects just another sort of disobedient student amongst many, you know,
yeah.
which is a beautiful thing. But and I think the students carry that legacy, so they carry less the legacy of the Zaha than the Rem. Although that comes with a little bit of a proviso. Then they expect to be doing something different. They expect to be.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's a fair number of people, particularly into the postgraduate programs, that want to be taught by some of those kind of key names that are producing significant work globally.
Mm-hmm.
And that is still a draw. But I think coming into the undergraduate program, it's a very, very diverse group of people. I mean, we have students from 80 different countries, and they're there living in apartments in London, fending for themselves. I think that has a very particular flavor that I think would be hard to capture if we had more sort of institutional depth, I suppose.
What's your role as director? What are you doing, or how do you think about your role is maybe a better question, because I think what you're saying is really interesting to me. Like that as somebody sort of leading that institution, you have to be involved in creating a culture where experimentation and radicalism and disobedience is
Mhm.
accepted and encouraged, while also sort of I told you before we recorded we're not going to talk about vision, but like also looking, sort of
Mm.
looking ahead. How do you think about what your role is in that culture?
Hmm. It's really interesting because I did listen to your very, very good interview with Sarah Whiting, who was talking about being like an editor and
Yeah,
rejected the
yeah.
idea of director. And actually, I quite like the idea of being a director, but more in the film sense, but
Uh,
not in a Stanley Kubrick way, but more in a sort of Richard Linklater way. There's a lot of improvisation that goes
Slacker.
on.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. No, I think in many respects it's about listening and maybe following the improvisation metaphor, saying yes.
Mm,
It seems like a very, very simple thing. I have to do a whole lot from obviously all the bureaucracy because we don't have a university.
right.
All of that sort of administrative responsibility, all of the financial responsibility, etc., ends with me. But also, the signing off of a poster from the graphics department. But then I also will have a student who wants to come in and get a recommendation for a novel. It's like
Mm,
it covers everything. And I think I've made quite a bit of this sort of open door policy, but the door to my office stays open always, unless it's a really confidential conversation and people pop in. And this might
mm,
seem very, very, very minimal as an approach to how you run an institution, but being available, answering questions, being open to a conversation again with a first year student through to, the head of finance is
mhm,
really critical. And then to treat all of those conversations as on a par, as horizontal in their hierarchy, I think makes a big difference because people feel heard and they understand that things can move very quickly. There was a really good example. We had a postgraduate student who, oh my goodness, I can't remember what year, he brought over, I think, 6,000, maybe I'm minimizing his collection of his books from Kiev in Ukraine prior to the invasion. But and he opened this mini library in Peckham, and it became a real center for the Ukrainian community. And then the lease was running out, so he's like, "Can I bring my library to the AA?" I was like, "Sure." and and then we found a space, and he's been having events and readings and performances, and suddenly this becomes a new place for people to gather, and it's
mhm,
part of a kind of a public offering. Now, that's just saying yes to a person who has an interesting idea, a bit of need, and then finding a way to make it happen. Those are where the ideas kind of keep on turning over in a productive way. But again, yeah, I think listening really hard, being open, trying not to have a knee-jerk reaction to pretty much anything.
Yeah,
So
right.
if that even
Always good
answers the
advice.
um, but yeah, I mean, again, it's what we have, I think something like 500 members of staff. I mean, some of these are people who give seminars, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
seminars a year, but that goes through from catering all the way, through to technical studies and history and theory, unit tutors. It is a funny kind of orchestration of managing people's expectations. And I think that when it comes to moving in a singular direction, it's quite it's not easy, but it's not hard to identify key themes that run throughout the school.
Mm,
And I think the aim, which comes out of an ambition towards a kind of more interdisciplinary practice, is that you can start to build a conversation from the first year through to PhD and the sort of research objectives that preoccupy our staff. And then the conversation starts to cohere around approaches to the future or to history or to kind of current political activism within architecture. And by really just getting people together in the same space is the start of how you put research grants together, if that's the kind of formal
Mhm.
end of the spectrum, or simply how you hold an event. And I think that
Right.
that's been really interesting from maybe to to sidetrack from Sarah Whiting's time to maybe a curatorial role of, you know, of again, bringing the right voices together in conversation with one another and also enabling them to take that forward without too much structure. There's one really good example where we had a fantastic exhibition in collaboration with the Warburg. Warburg, is
Oh, yeah.
Abby Warburg's
Yeah.
collection,
Yeah.
incredible library that then traveled. So we had this
Yeah.
itinerant exhibition. So some students in Aho in Norway had made these models of the spaces of the Warburg Library.
Oh, wow.
And we exhibited those models at the AA and then just used this as an opportunity to talk about the relationship between the Warburg and the AA as weird institutions, like independent institutions that were, I suppose, quite rogue in the way in which they practiced uh, education, but also practiced the accumulation of knowledge and the
Hmm.
ordering of that knowledge.
Hmm.
And that, I think, one of our new members of staff just started a seminar, like an optional seminar evening, where he brought together students again from across the school, tutors, people from outside to talk about the nature of knowledge, the nature of the institution. I didn't ask him to do that. He just wanted to. And out of
Yeah.
that comes a bunch of people from different institutions around London. Again, students from second year, again, through to PhD, to people like Shin Nagashiro who's been teaching in the school forever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they produce work out of it. And there's a spontaneous desire to get involved that I think wouldn't happen if it had sort of a curricular purpose, you know?
Yeah, I want to try to connect a couple things you said there because I think this is a really interesting thread to follow. I'm going to repeat back to you three things that you said and see if you can sort of
Mm,
connect those for me. I think it's really interesting how you're talking about how there are these sort of discussions and conversations that are just happening in the community, and certain themes or ideas or methodologies or theories start to sort of bubble up and become sort of larger topics of discussion. And then you could sort of take that and then scale that up to this idea of interdisciplinary
mm,
education. That it's not just architecture, capital A, you're learning how to design buildings that will then be constructed. How do all those things connect to something else? And then this idea of the curator, I think, is really interesting here. And I'm wondering, if we wanted to teach a current architecture student, or if we want to really complicate this question, a current design student in any type of design, they'd be in school forever. There's so much, there are so many different things that we could be teaching a current student, from the very practical professional side to the theory to history um to how it connect, kind of cultural, economic, how it connects to everything else. How do you think about curating curriculums to produce, sort of future architectural thinkers, or sort of design thinkers? How do you think about sort of bringing all of this stuff together into some sort of package that a student can go through?
I wish I had one of my students here. In one of these Warburg seminars, one of our kind of part two students of fourth year, she said, the important thing about the AA is that you curate your own path.
Ah,
You have to make your decisions around the seminars you attend. You choose your unit. And you choose your unit amongst, there's 40 units now in the school. I would say there's 18 and 22 between parts one and part two. And she put it really well in that you're taught to make good choices and to
mm,
have a degree and to stand by them or stand behind them. And I think that there's something about maybe the internationalism of the school. Perhaps it's single disciplinarity, despite the fact it feels very interdisciplinary, which we can come back to.
yeah.
Students are very resourceful and quite brave. And I
Mm.
think that from when I started teaching, I really always thought that building that bravery amongst our students enables them to engage in the conversations because you never learn everything.
Right.
You know, you're always going out into the world. Certainly, practical and technical skills end up coming so much later.
Hmm.
You know, I think when I finished my degrees, I still hadn't a clue as to, really how to handle a wall build-up. I mean, I got there in the
Yeah.
end, but it definitely wasn't what was concerning me at the time. And I think that, the students come out with so many different skills, but they've had a variety of experiences. So they've tasted
Mhm.
a bunch of stuff. And then they can go out in the world and perhaps engage in the discussions that they choose to engage in. There are certain things that start to divide them. And I think, we all have a set of priorities. And when I used to teach, first year core courses, I used to explain kind of architectural theory and that we all know that society is really complex and there's people who are trying to tidy it up. And there's people who are trying to really, I suppose, represent that complexity.
Uh,
That's a very binary split across all of architectural history.
yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
works. So,
Oh, that's
you
interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that. I love that. Yeah.
but I think that you can't be both. So there's one kind of key binary. You're either someone who is involved in typological thinking, or you're someone, like a Zaha, who is, really influenced by someone like German Expressionism. I think
Hmm.
you think
Hmm.
about the ways in which we deal with complexity. But, beyond that, you make a series of choices, whether you're politically engaged, at what scale you operate, whether that's really working within participatory practice or whether you're deeply committed to historic responsibility in relation to decolonization, or you're someone who has future-led fictive thinking that creates narratives of hope in really radical ways. And that kind of creates, I suppose, a spectrum or a set of orientations that enable students to have those conversations. And then I think the wonderful thing about the AA is that they're always in conversation with someone who doesn't agree with them. And that's
Yeah.
been the legacy for so long. It's a place of disagreement. And I think that disagreements become increasingly polite. I hope that that doesn't sort of, take the oomph out of it. But
Mhm.
I think some of those really great blow up arguments that used to happen back in the day that were celebrated are probably just totally inappropriate.
Right.
I would
Yeah.
argue.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think a degree of resourcefulness, bravery, a capacity to understand how to curate a path, how to curate a conversation, I think is what that sort of architectural education is there for. I would say I have very little anxiety about its relationship to the profession. I don't think about it much. I think
Yeah.
our students can do bizarre things for 5 years and they still end up in the profession functioning fine, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So, um, but I think, I mean, I could go on all day, but this question of interdisciplinarity has its own problems. And I think, oof, um, maybe happens less than people think, even in bigger
Yeah.
institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I have like two questions related to that may or may not speak to sort of what you just said. Because I think I recently talked to Nicholas DeMantia, who's the director of the architecture program at MIT, and he was talking about how at MIT there is an effort to basically teach design across all major, that there's a way of thinking that a designer or an architect has that is beneficial for if you're studying economics or medicine or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and to me, this raises two questions that I think you're starting to speak to a little bit. One, does that produce and I'm not asking you to speak about MIT as, sort of generally. Um, how does that produce, or does that produce a type of arrogance of the designer that they can solve any kind of problem, that they can sort of, jump, skip, and hop between disciplines with their expertise, that it is sort of equally applicable everywhere? And so, does that expansion actually need some type of humility to sort of do that? But then the flip side is, what then is the core of an architecture education, or what is
Mhm.
the point of an architecture education or design education if everybody else is learning these things also.
Mm,
Um, I'm really interested in that tension. I think like you're sort of speaking to that a little bit with the sort of the challenges of interdisciplinarity, and then also this everyone's curating their own education. What does that actually sort of like look like in practice?
yeah, I mean, I suppose if I just couch this sort of curating your own degree,
Right, right.
obviously there is an academic framework and people do
Right,
specific
I
things, but
understand. Yeah.
you know, um, we have all sorts of various regulations, but I think this issue of you, several things that you said obviously concern me as well. One, I think I really don't believe in solution-based thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's really problematic in schools of architecture more generally, because if acquiring lots of knowledge and then producing a design out of lots of knowledge, any good social scientist would tell you that's like horrible causality.
Yeah. You're speaking
And
my language.
we
And
should just
yes.
disappear. No, but it comes up a lot, and I think students feel very um oh goodness, if anything, they have too much humility and that they're scared to take a risk or to
Uh,
propose something that isn't based on a body of research that leads them in a specific and correct direction. And that's
yeah.
fatal for design. It's actually fatal for good research. I suspect that the what design can contribute to other disciplines is sort of disordered thinking.
Mm,
It's,
mm-hmm.
yeah, to be fair, I think, my dad was a theoretical physicist at some point at MIT.
Mm,
And his capacity to think laterally made him good. It wasn't following a particular train of thought. And I think that's something that's so embedded within a sort of architectural education. And then also, I think we forget that there is still individual agency within, architectural or any kind of design profession, that the thing
yeah.
that you produce is going to be different from the thing I produce, even if
Yeah.
the conditions are the same. And there's tremendous delight in that, in, I suppose, individual innovation, the peculiarities of the singular architect, the singular student. I used to, when I was teaching in first year, I used to say to students, okay, do three proposals. I took this also into like graduate education. Three proposals. One of them is like the most obvious thing you can think of. Another one that's completely absurd. And then the third just you know, for good measure. And this guy said to me once, well, I can't do the most obvious thing. So what's the most obvious? He said, well, we're next to these railway arches. So I would just do like 100-story arches. I'm like, no one else was, that's really not obvious to anyone else. But it produces this insane and wonderful project that comes out of the imagination of the individual. And I think
Yeah.
that's one really important aspect. When it comes to interdisciplinarity working the other direction, I get very frustrated with architecture students who assume they can absorb complex economic understanding or sociological understanding or philosophical understanding or goodness, neurological understanding from, I don't know, Wikipedia and apply that to a project. They should be in a position where they go and ask a neurologist or they go and ask
Mm-hmm.
an economist, and that they work in that collaborative way because they don't know anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something wonderful in architecture is that yes, we have a discipline, but we don't have much knowledge in that we know where a damp membrane goes, we know how bricks are made, maybe, but the innovation comes out of the not knowing. So we should be reliant on this incredible range of experts, and we should have the humility and the confidence to go and ask them. And that's where I find architectural education super interesting because it is infinitely broad,
Yeah.
but it also, the practical aspect of it is that we are still involved in asking how to make our physical environment, I wouldn't say necessarily better, but perhaps respond in different ways to a shifting context or a shifting set of priorities, and bringing all that knowledge together without simply being the diplomat or the negotiator at the table. I mean, I think we bring something very specific. We bring creative thinking, basically.
I agree with that 100%. And I maybe have a question. I have a thought that I'm going to try to frame as a question. And the question might just be keep talking about what you're talking about. But, because I think, when you're talking about architecture not having a lot of knowledge, I think about graphic design, which has even less of a history, even less of a sort of defined discourse, even less of um, uh, academic history, even also. And what I often see in graphic design, because of that lack of knowledge, is and you spoke to this a little bit too, a type of insecurity. We're not measured up like these others, and so what I see often in graphic design is a borrowing or a stealing of other disciplines and then applying it to us. Like, okay, we'll be more like engineers because engineers, they have that linear thinking, they have to do that, so we'll do that, and then you get like design processes that are sort of like,
Mm,
rigid out like an engineer. It's like, oh, we'll be like social scientists, we'll be human centered, and then it's sort of that, but it's always like the light version of those
mm,
things because we're not engineers and we're not social sciences. And I appreciate the effort and I understand the effort, but I can't help but wonder, is that actually closing off that knowledge that we do have? What makes being a designer unique? If you start to design like an engineer, all that work's going to start to look the same and it sort of loses that design piece. Um, and so can you sort of talk about that creative thinking, that sort of core knowledge that the architects and the designers have, and how to engage at these sort of different levels with that without sort of losing that core or losing that sort of um I don't know the word, but sort of like losing that what makes what we do what we do. you know, you know what I mean?
yeah, I don't know. It's really hard because I think that the knowledge is always expanding. I mean, if you think about it, practical knowledge, material knowledge, even historical knowledge is
Mm,
enormous, and you
yeah,
only touch little bits of it. So each of these things are a set of tools. Um, they also fit into a particular method. So it was interesting the other day. I have a, a unit that are essentially they're sculptors, and they come out
mm,
of a fine art background, and their students present their work, and they say, "I've done this thing." And
yeah,
like that is wonderful, but why? But why? What's the context? What's the wider kind of social implications? What does this relate to contextually? Have you made the material decisions? What levels of experimentation have you been through? And you feel terrible because they've produced a wonderful thing for no apparent reason.
right, right,
And, and it still has value. But I think what's interesting is it made me reflect on the nature of architectural education as very methodological, in that we have an expectation of the way in which you set up a problem, the way in which you, perhaps within, the humanities or the social sciences, you would say you establish a set of research questions that are manifest through design proposals. And then how you rationalize those decisions, economically, socially, politically,
yeah,
materially, technically, um, tectonically. And I think that one is simply, I suppose, providing a coherent enough rationale that picks up different bodies of knowledge. But I don't know whether the knowledge itself is as important, really, in any discipline as it used to be. And that, yes,
mm,
we know what a wall buildup is, and we understand that walls need a degree of ventilation, or we get mildew, et cetera, et cetera. But then, I would say 5, 10 years ago, people started experimenting with, massive masonry walls, which is, traditional building methods. So even those things are being challenged all the time. So I think it's more that through the methodology, we have different forms of experimentation that are experimenting largely from first principles. And the
yeah,
first principles thinking draws on the knowledge that is necessary rather than being like one canon. And,
yeah,
the question
yeah,
of canon
yeah,
is like a whole other can of
yeah,
worms.
yeah. I mean, I know you've done a lot of thinking and talking and writing about canons and whether canon exists and explaining the canon for whom, who defines that canon, and that is a discourse again in graphic design that I'm involved in and interested in, and thinking about that canon, not just a historical canon, but even a canon of knowledge, a canon of practical skills, and talking about this expand how this is expanding all the time. There's always sort of new things being added to it. I'm sort of constantly trying to figure out when I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What is worth keeping and bringing forward, and what can we get rid of or
Mm,
put aside? And maybe this goes back to the conversation about kind of curating a curriculum. But how
Mm.
do you think about that? How do you think about sort of the core or the foundation that all these new discourses can be built upon, or even, or is there even a foundation? I guess is
Mm.
the is the question.
Oh man, it's a really tough one. And, I wrestle with this back and forth, as you may know. I think, I went through an amazing education system. I did my degree in Cambridge, and I think we had, and I think there still is, sort of the beginning of time through to 1800 and then 1800 to now in Berkshire.
Yeah,
And, um, I wrote essays on Mesopotamia and the Baroque and all of that. And I looked in detail at buildings. You know, we we visited buildings, we drew them, and I have an understanding of urban form because of that, and I know so much. And now then you turn around to a group, say, of first year undergraduates who are from all over the world, and I don't know if you can just teach them Mies and Le Corbusier, and like
yeah,
it's it just doesn't work. But the
yeah,
question is how do you equip those students to have the capacity to analyze a space without looking at them and without understanding that those ideas fold in on each other and they expand and they evolve. And what I did one year is I tried to trace the sort of that kind of pre-modern, well, pre-architectural modern moment through modernity, through its expansion around the world to that postmodern moment, through kind of to the now to say, okay, how do these ideas manifest in
yeah,
different ways?
yeah,
How do they, I suppose, how do they align to kind of global tendencies that are not universally evil? It's just there's a moment in time where even people in parts of the globe who were decolonizing are still trying to appear global. That interests me a lot because then suddenly you can look at where buildings and urban form start to express a shifting set of ambitions. And to me, that was quite useful, but it's a tremendous amount for students to absorb because it's
yeah,
really understanding like several crises in
yeah,
history, alone architectural history.
yeah.
And then this year we really had them look at case studies themselves. So they would choose case studies and often from wherever the country origin was, etc., as well as, some list that we made for them that might be interesting. I'll see how that whether that pays off, because then essentially all we taught them was a series of questions
Right.
and approaches. But I don't know. I mean, the number of people who will then say, but I don't know anything about architecture. And I
Yeah.
remember at some point someone said, shouldn't your graduates be able to sit at a dinner party and be able to talk about architecture? It's like, well, I don't know about that. I don't think that's necessarily why I'm educating them.
That's the
But it's
point.
an
That's what this
interesting
is all
question.
for. Dinner parties.
Yes. But then, you could ask the same thing of we have amazing graphic designers who, two of them are really, quite young. They're just kind of straight out of school themselves. And I remember we had this whole conversation about typography.
Mhm,
And, they were setting out a book and they had no rules. And
mhm.
we're like, should we just go and get that Swiss book for them?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And to me, it's like, how did they not learn this? It's so basic, like
Right.
margins. But it's the same thing people say about architecture. It's like, how can they not understand foundations and
Yeah.
damper membranes and how a
Yeah.
roof is insulated? It's like, well, we don't teach that because it's it's a form of canon. It's a form of structure that isn't correct.
Mhm.
There is no particular correct, but also there's very few reference points. And I don't quite know where I'm trying to position myself with regard to that because, you can't leave a group of students who are already suffering from years and years of uncertainty,
Right.
anxiety, and say like, we're in a postmodern moment. There is no truth.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really tough on them. Um, so
I'm
I don't have an answer, I think,
I mean,
yet.
I'm in the same position, and I love that you brought up typography because that was the exact context that really started questioning all of this a couple years ago. I had some seniors, undergraduate seniors who I had never had before, who margins were inconsistent, typography, sort of all the quote unquote rules that I had been taught, they didn't know. And I asked them about it and they didn't know what I was talking about. It was like, well, this should be an M dash. What's an M dash? And I was like, well, how do you not know what an M dash is? And then I was like, well, do you need to know what an M dash is? Is
Yeah.
this actually, are these rules? Like who made, why do we, maybe this doesn't matter. And this is sort of my crisis of the last 5 years now. And I still don't have an answer. So I guess it's makes me feel good that you don't have a good answer.
Yeah, I suppose it also, it will vacillate back and forth. And I remember when Peter Saville came to speak, he was saying, pretty much anyone can make good graphic design now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore graphic design is essentially trying to look really unprofessional.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And maybe architecture has a similar, I mean, there's a huge distrust of sort of professionalism within most design fields now,
Hmm.
in that, it is synonymous with a kind of authority that
Right.
feels wrong, feels, I suppose, under the control of aspects of, capitalism, of consumerism, of everything that is destroying the planet, and therefore there's everything is wrong. So
Right. Right.
everything has to operate as this at this kind of very small scale incidental level of kind of temporary intervention, which I think Aaron Betsky is probably
Mm.
touched upon at some
Yeah. Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very an-architecture idea.
Yeah. And then what happens to, do we I'm really going off on a tangent, but do we need cultural institutions? Should we build museums? I mean, all of these big projects that are then identified with these really extraordinary famous architects,
Yeah.
do we no longer produce those projects, or do we not produce them in, the West or global North? You know, but we still send these architects out to essentially
Yeah.
build museums all over everywhere else, because it's very conflicted. Um, while we make small scale acupuncture in our own environments, again, we're in a slightly weird state of flux, I
L-
would argue.
let me ask you this question, which is either a very pointed, specific question, or it's another really sort of wide open question that will
Mm,
be hard to answer. But in the welcome letter that you wrote for the AA website, you write the AA was first established by a collective of young architects who set out to challenge the structure of architectural education. As a self initiated project, the aim was to create a place of debate and a new framework for learning. This is
mm,
what we've been talking about for the last 20, 30 minutes or so.
mm,
But what strikes me is in many ways, because everything is in flux, all of this is experimental right now. Everything is being challenged. And so, what does experimental architecture education look like today? Like, what makes something experimental today? Or how do you sort of create that sort of challenging the structure of architecture education today in 2024? What does that actually look like?
yeah. I mean, I suppose in the origins of the AA, it was challenging what was essentially an apprenticeship system,
Right.
which was then had, I suppose, aspects of corruption embedded
Right.
within it,
Right.
pretty basic. So just to be able to have a conversation around, architecture and history, and, essentially to be some sort of men in a darkened room talking
Right.
about things.
Yeah.
Um, what makes it, yeah, this is actually just a question more generally. I mean, being radical or experimental in any design field at the moment is really, really hard. It's
Yeah.
sort of everything's been done.
Yeah.
Um, I was about to say, in pretty much any field, doing something that nobody sees would be quite experimental. That's the whole other matter. Um,
I'll
um,
never release this episode. This is just this is just
yes,
for us. This is the
exactly.
experimental episode.
Oh man, but no, I mean, I also maybe I'm not that interested in being experimental for its own sake. I mean, I think that there's so many there's so many challenging issues out there, from the way in which we deal with the canon, we deal with our history, the way in which we combat climate crisis. Everyone's talking about these things, but the capacity to actually do something or approach them intelligently probably needs not to be experimental. It needs to probably be quite focused and
Mm,
forceful. And it has to sort of, be as resourceful with whatever it has on offer, be that traditional or experimental or, completely ludicrous. Everything has to be tried right now. And I think that that's maybe we have to be less precious about our originality.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you are experimental just to be experimental, that's actually a type of conservatism. That's actually like it's still you're still sort of following the structures that have been set in place. You're
Yeah.
just doing it in a different way.
It's also deeply narcissistic, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah,
It's the sort of, I'm mad, I am kind of mentality.
right.
Yeah. Doesn't really help that many people. And that also doesn't mean, I think that the problem is that it feels that the opposite end of the spectrum is joyless. And I think that that's equally problematic.
Yeah,
And, the level of human invention is really extraordinary. And it is experimental in that it's always looking at new things. It's inspired by unexpected inputs. And, you know, I suppose things being surprising and optimistic is is probably better than straight up experimentation. Without going back to sort of, each person having a unique outlook, those outlooks are refreshing in most cases. They're very hopeful in most cases. If you sit over the last 2 weeks, I sat in on all of the reviews bar one. So I got through 39 units.
oh
And
wow, wow.
which well, it's a lot of information, but by and large, those students are deeply passionate about whatever they're looking at. In many cases, truly innovative, with some levels of naivete, and there's at this stage there's a lack of coherence in some areas, but they're really throwing themselves at a lot of stuff. They're trying so many different ways of attempting to articulate something. I used to say to first year students, architecture is a little bit like, you wake up from a dream and then you can't remember exactly what it was, and you're just
Yeah,
trying to get it down.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And you sort of never quite get close to it, but it's always close enough. So you're just kind of scrambling around the edges of a more coherent idea. And out of that comes some really strange projects, which
Hmm.
are wonderful. And that's someone will have one very odd set of ideas in first year and a totally different set of ideas in fifth year. And then by the time they graduate, they'll have some set of priorities that enable them to go and do something useful, whatever useful is.
Yeah,
And I think that gives me, I mean, I'm tremendously optimistic in that regard. And I think that, yeah, the level of creativity is pretty unfettered. And that doesn't necessarily come out of the institution. You just have to give them the space to do it. It comes out of the fact that students are mainly pretty amazing.
I really like that. We've spent this conversation talking about the AA, talking about architecture and design education generally, talking about your role as a director or editor or curator. I want to talk a little bit more specifically about your work and your background, and maybe how that sort of influences this larger conversation we've been having. Um, you have a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in something called cities. Is that what is that what it's actually your PhD
Yes,
is
I
in
mean,
cities?
to be totally accurate, I started it there, I finished it in Cambridge. So,
Okay, okay, okay.
but yeah,
But your PhD was called, and tell me if any of this is wrong, Washington, D.C. and the Idea of America, a reappraisal of the 1791 plan for the nation's capital. Tell
yeah.
me why that was interesting to you and give me the broad strokes of what you were
Oh, wow.
interested in with the design, development, and construction of Washington, D.C.'s city plan.
Mhm. This is this could go on for some time. Um, I grew up in Washington, D.C. Um, and actually I did a third year dissertation on that as well. I found it fascinating as, I suppose, a political project more generally. Um, I would say, the PhD is something that sort of happened alongside a lot of other things.
Right, right.
I dropped and kind of picked up again. I think that it became fascinating because I am always captivated by the idea that architecture and urban form are capable or of at least attempting to describe a set of political ideas. I don't think they necessarily do so successfully, but that early plan for 1791 is this incredible transposition of a kind of French idea of the Republic onto this endless, potentially endless continent.
Hmm.
And it it's a moment in time where, yeah, sort of key aspects of really radical political thought as they were emerging in the 18th century were essentially transposed onto landscape as well.
Right, right.
So, and I think that the way in which then the wider landscape has been embedded in the American imagination and how civic space is becomes a kind of parkland is still somehow rooted in an American psyche, which I find absolutely extraordinary. Um, Something I should probably go back to at some point. But yeah, I mean, I think that the capacity, particularly for new nations to express themselves through architecture and urbanism,
Yeah, yeah.
is an ongoing preoccupation of mine.
The reason I wanted to ask you about it is I was thinking about it when you were speaking earlier about giving your, I think you were talking about first year students and how you can't just teach them, Mies anymore. And so you have them look at these case studies or these projects and sort of, apply these different sort of theories or ideologies onto them. And in many ways, it seems like Washington, D.C. is an example of that also. Um, I often talk about design and architecture being a type of ideology made concrete, ideology made artifact, a way to sort of, um, make values permanent in some way or more permanent in some way. I'm wondering how you think about that. And I'm sort of moving a little bit away from the PhD, but you can maybe talk about what you learned from that process into the role that you have now. Running an institution is also a design project. There are structures in place, and you've been talking about structures of moving through curriculum or structures of seminars or individual projects. How how going through that PhD process, how really thinking about those sort of uh, actualizing these ideas in architecture, does that influence how you think about your job today and sort of
Mm,
the actualization of your values, of the AA's values, of uh the visions for the future, how you actually sort of make that concrete in structures,
mm,
moving through
mm.
curriculum, the way students interact with each other, public programming, publishing, etc.
Maybe the PhD and the PhD is a funny, felt always a bit like a side gig, So, um, yeah, and I think probably more importantly, I think the work in an academic environment, in a professional environment, in a conversation, all of those things are real. Like I feel very strongly that education is not a dress rehearsal for something later. Students and staff are engaged in an important debate that
Hmm.
is real. It takes place in time. It has implications. I also, in a very old-fashioned way, I think that we're in the business of trying to make the world a better place, basically. And I I think that it's a way of kind of treating the work that we do seriously without being self-serious about it, I suppose.
Mm.
And I think that that leads in a very particular direction. So, if I kind of pick a handful of themes that I think are strong in the school, we have a handful of units that are political activists. They are really engaged in the impact of policy on urban space. They care deeply about what happens next. They want to be involved. They want to make change for good. They they can't stand the way in which housing is moving in the UK, let alone elsewhere. And they want to be part of it. And
Mhm.
that is an immediate and very tangible and kind of small scale set of political intentions where architectural thinking has real implications.
Mhm.
I think then, working backwards, probably the project I'm most proud of at the moment is that we're digitizing the work of the Department of Tropical Architecture, which ran from like 1954 to 1971. And yeah, in some cases, that was about disseminating tropical modernism all over the global south, because all of these people who then became practitioners in West Africa, in parts of Asia, South Latin America, they learned their craft at the AA and they went back and did AA.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really problematic, but also, that's a set of stories about the way in which one takes responsibility for an attempt to look at, really, it was an environmental design program. It was about understanding climate in relation to architecture. But that produced a set of narratives that has a rolling set of implications. And I
Yeah.
think we have an obligation to understand what education does. So, we're archiving that, we're making an online resource, we're reaching out to all those alumni and looking at what happened next. Because, what happens next helps us understand how we teach.
Mm.
And then, I think that there are all sorts of wider issues. We're starting this program next year. We're opening it up next year, and at the moment, it's called "Existing Things of Relative Value,"
Ah, I like that.
which it's in theory is a conservation course, but it's more about reuse. And I think again that question of what has value within the built environment, materially, socially, historically, from a cathedral to a car park. Again, it's like if we can look at a future and see how we impact that future through debate, through discussion, through decision making, through architecture is one thing. But then how do we deal with what we have? How do we attribute value? How do we challenge that value? Has deep ramifications for doing design.
Yeah.
And then I suppose just being a kind of conscious member of society, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
what do we do with what we have? How do we contend with what we did? And how do we do better in the future? And I think, by and large, that's something that, from a sort of a basic kind of ethical framework is what's directing me in the direction of the school. And then perhaps an overly optimistic and unrealistic attitude that I think the students that graduate will do better. They will do something incredibly important and they care passionately about the right things. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of good enough for me,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's not one thing, but it's kind of like an ethical compass, you know?
I think that's a really nice way to wrap up this conversation. So I'm going to ask you the question I use to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Ha, this is an interesting one. I probably watch more than I read. I love films more than anything else, but
Aaron, going back to Aaron Betsky, he said the same thing.
oh, really?
Yeah.
I eat films. Oh, I love them so much. But reading, I suppose the last thing I've been reading is I've gone back to George Orwell
Mm,
and Coming Up
mm-hmm,
for Air,
mm-hmm,
which just, I mean, out of a world of, admin and academia, his writing is so extraordinary. And actually, Coming Up for Air is not that well known or much read, but the way in it which describes this really shocking transition from traditional culture to modernity, the effect of particularly the First World War on these rural environments in the UK, is so carefully and slowly paced and is
mm.
just fascinating and completely compelling. So, yeah, but
Well, I have to ask now, what have you been watching lately too?
oh my goodness, I think I'm a movie addict in
Yeah,
the streaming service. I think one of the more recent things I really loved was Christian Petzold's Phoenix, which is an
I haven't seen that one yet.
oh, it's fantastic. It's about a woman who returns home having survived Auschwitz, and her husband doesn't recognize her.
Mm,
I'll leave it at that because it again very, very subtle, very slow, um, and I mean heart-wrenching, but again in a very non-obvious way. Really, really extraordinary. About identity, about loss, about betrayal, um, about love despite betrayal. I mean,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and then set in this sort of very unglamorized Berlin,
Yeah. Okay.
really amazing,
All
really
right.
amazing.
I'm adding it to my list. I saw that you were a big film person. I was doing everything I could to not just make this whole conversation about movies and filmmaking, which I could have easily done. Um, Ingrid, this was great. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed this.
Enormous pleasure. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Ingrid Schroder. It was recorded on March 25th, 2024. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.